The night my daughter moved back in, I made pot roast. I remember standing at the stove, stirring the gravy, thinking that this was what mothers did. You open the door, you set the table, you make it smell like home. Sandra had called me 3 weeks earlier, crying so hard I could barely make out the words. She and her husband Kevin had lost the house. Their mortgage had gone underwater. The bank had sent notices, and now they had nowhere to go. She had a daughter, my granddaughter Brianna, who was 8 years old and needed stability. What was I supposed to say? No? I was 63 at the time. My husband, Dennis, had passed 4 years before from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning. He was drinking his coffee and reading the paper, and then he was gone. Just like that. The house felt enormous after he died. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a yard with the oak tree Dennis had planted when Sandra was born. Some mornings I would walk from room to room and not know what I was looking for. So when Sandra called and asked if they could stay, just for a little while, just until they got back on their feet, I told her yes, without hesitating. I thought it would be 3 months. Maybe 4. That was 6 years ago. The first few weeks were fine, or fine enough. Sandra helped with dishes sometimes. Kevin said he was applying for jobs in logistics, which was his field. Brianna was quiet and polite and would sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked. I liked having the noise back in the house. I liked hearing the television in the evenings and footsteps on the stairs in the morning. Grief had made the silence feel like a weight, and now the weight was lifted. I told myself this was a good thing. I believed it then. Kevin got 1 interview in that first month. Then the interviews stopped, but the explanations kept coming. The market was slow. His resume needed updating. He had a lead that was about to come through. I nodded and said I understood and went back to the kitchen. Sandra worked part-time at a nail salon downtown, Tuesdays and Thursdays, which covered her phone bill and not much else. I covered everything else. The mortgage on a house that had Dennis's name on it and now had Kevin's truck in the driveway. The electric bill. The water. The groceries, which had tripled since 3 more people started eating every meal here. I had Dennis's life insurance, a modest amount, and my savings from 31 years teaching 5th grade. I also had my Social Security, which I'd started drawing at 62. It was enough for 1 person living carefully. It was not enough for 4 people, 2 of whom contributed almost nothing. I went back to work. There was a dry cleaning shop 2 miles from my house, called Brentwood Cleaners, owned by a Korean couple named the Kims, who had run it for 20 years. I had been a customer for years and knew them both by name. Mrs. Kim was the one who asked me, one afternoon when I came in to pick up a blazer, if I was looking for anything. She said it casually, the way people do when they already suspect the answer. I told her yes, actually, I was. I started the following Monday. My shift was Tuesday through Saturday, 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. I sorted clothes, ran the front register, steamed garments, and helped customers. The work wasn't hard exactly, but my feet weren't 23 anymore, and by noon, they would be aching in a way that traveled up through my knees and into my lower back. I wore compression socks that Dennis would have found hilarious. I came home every afternoon smelling faintly of chemical solvent and other people's fabric. The first time I came home and found Kevin asleep on the couch at noon with the television on full volume, I didn't say anything. He was a grown man, and I told myself it wasn't my place. The second time, I stepped over his outstretched legs to get to the kitchen and started making lunch for myself. He woke up, looked at me, and said, and I did. Because that's what I did. Sandra, to be fair, did more than Kevin. She cleaned the bathroom occasionally and kept Brianna's room tidy. But there was a particular way she had of asking for things that made them sound less like requests and more like corrections. Mom, we're out of paper towels again. Not a question. Not a could you please. Just a statement of fact that she expected me to resolve. I would go to the store, I would restock the paper towels. I would come home, and she would be on her phone, and we would not discuss it. Brianna was the bright part. She was growing into a girl who liked to read and had opinions about things, the kind of child who would follow me to the kitchen just to talk while I cooked. She called me Grandma Dot. She would show me her drawings and explain each one with complete seriousness, as if I were an art critic whose judgment mattered. I loved her in the way that cuts deep, the way you love someone who still needs you without knowing how much. But even Brianna started to change, slowly, in ways I noticed and tried not to name. One evening I was washing dishes after dinner I had shopped for, prepared, and served, and Brianna came in and stood behind me. I thought she wanted to talk. Instead, she said, "Dad says you should get a dishwasher." I turned around and looked at her. She wasn't being cruel. She was 9 years old and repeating something her father had said. And that was exactly what made it land the way it did. I turned back to the sink and said, "I'll think about it, honey." I did not think about it. I stood there and finished the dishes and told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. There is a particular psychology to being slowly diminished by the people you love, and I did not understand it fully until my friend Ruth pointed it out. Ruth had been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together. She was blunt in the way that only real friends are allowed to be, and she had been watching my situation for years with increasing concern. We had lunch every other Wednesday at a diner called Marion's, and Ruth would ask how things were going, and I would say fine, and she would look at me the way she did when she knew I was lying. One Wednesday, about 4.5 years in, she set down her coffee and said, "Dorothy, you are working at a dry cleaner's to pay your son-in-law's electricity bill while he naps on your couch. I need you to hear yourself." I started to explain. I said Sandra was trying. I said Kevin was going through a hard time. I said Brianna needed stability, and pulling the rug out from under them would hurt her most of all. Ruth listened to all of it. Then she said, "You're not protecting Brianna. You're teaching her that this is what women do. You're teaching her to disappear." I drove home from that lunch and sat in my car in the driveway for 15 minutes before going inside. Kevin's truck was there, as it always was. The lights were on in the living room, as they always were. I could hear the television through the closed front door. I sat in the car and looked at the house that Dennis had picked because of the oak tree in the yard. And I thought about what Ruth had said. And then I went inside and made dinner. But something had shifted. Not visibly, not yet. But something in me had gone quiet in a different way. The way a room goes quiet before something happens. The situation with my jewelry box was what moved things from slow erosion to something I could no longer explain away. Dennis had given me a pearl necklace on our 30th anniversary. It wasn't expensive by some measures, but it was the thing he had saved for, had gone to pick out himself, had wrapped in tissue paper, and hidden in the closet for a month. I wore it to church, and to his memorial service, and to Sandra's wedding. It lived in the wooden jewelry box on my dresser, the one Dennis had made in his garage workshop the year Sandra was born. One morning in March, I opened the box to find the necklace was not there. I searched the dresser, the nightstand, the bathroom counter. I went through the box 3 times. I stood in my bedroom for a long time, trying to account for where it could be, before I walked downstairs and asked Sandra if she had seen it. She didn't look up from her phone. She said, "I borrowed it for a thing a couple weeks ago." She said it the way you say you borrowed a pen. I stood in the doorway and looked at my daughter, who I had pushed into the world and nursed through fevers and driven to every dance recital and sat with when her first boyfriend broke her heart, and I said, very quietly, "That necklace was from your father." She looked up then. She said, "I know, Mom. I'll find it. Relax." I went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed. I did not relax. I found the necklace 2 days later, not in Sandra's room, but in the pocket of a jacket Kevin had left on the coat rack. I do not know with certainty what that means. I did not ask. I took the necklace, put it in my purse, and drove to the bank, where I rented a safety deposit box for the first time in my life. The day things finally broke open started like most days. I came home from Brentwood Cleaners at 2:15, feet sore, carrying a bag of groceries I'd stopped to get on the way. Kevin's truck was in the driveway. I assumed, correctly, that Kevin was inside. What I didn't expect was what I found in the kitchen. Every cabinet had been emptied onto the counter. Not cleaned, not reorganized, emptied as if someone had been looking for something and not bothered to put anything back. Boxes of cereal, canned goods, my good mixing bowls, a bag of rice that had tipped and spilled across the counter. There was a coffee mug on the floor, unbroken, but lying on its side. Kevin was sitting at the kitchen table eating chips and watching something on his phone with one earbud in. I set my groceries down. I looked at the counter. I looked at the floor. I looked at Kevin, who had not looked up. "What happened in here?" I asked. He pulled out one earbud. "Oh, Sandra was looking for the warranty card for the blender." The thing stopped working. He put the earbud back in. I stood in my own kitchen, surrounded by the contents of my own cabinets, still in my work clothes, smelling like dry cleaning solvent, and I waited to feel something erupt in me. What came instead was quieter and more certain. A long, slow settling, like sand after water stills. Like something deciding. I put the groceries away. I restacked the cans. I folded the cereal boxes closed and returned them to the shelves. I wiped the counter and swept the rice and set the coffee mug upright in the sink. Kevin ate his chips and watched his video and didn't say anything else, and neither did I. That night, after Sandra and Kevin had gone to bed and Brianna was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote down numbers. 6 years of mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, insurance, property tax. I am a methodical person, a former teacher, and I had been quietly tracking these things in a notebook for the last 2 years, ever since Ruth's comment had planted a seed I couldn't uproot. The total on the legal pad was a number that made me set down my pen and look at the wall for a while. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Hale, and a friend from church had used her for an estate matter and spoken highly of her. Her office was in a building downtown with a parking garage that cost $4. I had made an appointment for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday, and I sat across from her desk in a chair that was more comfortable than anything in my own living room, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She asked a few questions, practical ones, about whose name was on the lease, what agreements had been made in writing, whether I had documentation. I told her there was no lease. I told her there had never been a written agreement, just a phone call from my crying daughter, and a pot roast, and an assumption that love was sufficient collateral. Patricia looked at me steadily and said, "You have more rights than you think, but you'll need to follow the formal process. Even family members, without a lease, become month-to-month tenants after a period of time. You can give notice. It has to be in writing. It has to allow them the legal time to vacate." She explained the timeline. She explained what I needed to document. She explained what would happen if they refused to leave, and what legal tools I had if it came to that. I drove home from that appointment and sat in the car again, under the oak tree Dennis had planted, and I thought about the pearl necklace. I thought about 6 years of numbers on a legal pad. I thought about what Ruth had said. "You're teaching her to disappear." I thought about Brianna, who was 10 now, and had started to look at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite name, like she was watching something she didn't know how to stop. I wrote the letter that evening. I kept it factual and clear, the way I used to write parent communications when I taught school. I stated that I was informing them that the current living arrangement would be ending, and that I was giving them 60 days' notice to secure alternative housing. I stated that I wished them well and hoped they understood. I signed my name, Dorothy Elaine Marsh, in full, the way my mother had taught me to sign things that mattered. I slid it under Sandra's bedroom door at 7 in the morning, before I left for work. By the time I got home that afternoon, Sandra had called my phone 11 times. The conversation that followed was the hardest one I had ever had with my daughter, harder even than the calls the week after Dennis died, because grief is clean and this was not. She cried. She accused. She said I was abandoning Brianna, which hit the mark she intended. She said I had always made her feel like she wasn't good enough, which was either something she had believed for a long time or something she had retrieved specifically for this moment, and I couldn't be certain which. Kevin sat in the living room and said nothing, which was perhaps the most accurate version of Kevin I had ever seen. I sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table and I said, "I love you. I have always loved you, and I need my home back." She said, "This is so selfish." I said, "I know it feels that way." I didn't argue. I had learned, somewhere in those 6 years, that arguing with someone who is determined to misunderstand you is a way of volunteering to be misunderstood further. I had said what I needed to say. The letter had said the rest. The 60 days were difficult in the way that any slow ending is difficult. There were silences at dinner. There were pointed comments. One evening, Kevin said, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, that some people showed their true colors eventually. I stood in the hallway and breathed and did not respond. I was tired, but it was a different kind of tired than I had known for 6 years. It was the tired of someone who has been running and has chosen to stop, not the tired of someone who cannot find where the finish line is. Brianna was the one I worried about most, and she was, in the end, the one who surprised me. 2 weeks before they were scheduled to leave, she knocked on my bedroom door after school. She came in and sat on the edge of my bed, the way she used to when she was small, and she said, "Grandma Dot, are you okay?" I told her I was going to be. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "I heard Mom and Dad talking. They said you were being mean." She paused. "But I don't think you're being mean." I looked at her, this 10-year-old with her mother's dark eyes and her own particular seriousness, and I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think this is your house. I think it's been your house the whole time." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I told her she was right. I told her she was the smartest person I knew. I told her that no matter what happened, she was my granddaughter, and that was not a thing that could be given notice or packed into boxes. She hugged me. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo I still bought for her. I sat there and held my granddaughter and thought that whatever came next, I had not lost everything. I had not lost the part that mattered most. They moved out on a Friday in November. I had arranged to be at Ruth's house that day because I knew that watching them carry boxes out would undo me in ways I didn't have space for yet. Ruth made tea, and we sat on her porch, and she didn't say "I told you so," which is one of the things I love most about Ruth. She just sat with me and let the afternoon go by. When I came home, the house was quieter than it had been in a long time. The refrigerator had been cleared out, except for what was mine. The living room was back to its original arrangement, more or less, although there was a pale rectangle on the wall where a frame of theirs had hung and a scuff on the baseboard near the front door that hadn't been there before. Evidence of a chapter. I walked through the rooms slowly, not looking for anything this time. I went into Dennis's old office, which Kevin had been using as a storage space for 2 years, and which I had not been able to bring myself to go into more than briefly. The boxes were gone. The room was bare and a little dusty and smelled like the cedar of the closet. I opened the window. In the weeks that followed, I did things I had been putting off without quite realizing I was putting them off. I rearranged the furniture in the living room back to the way Dennis and I had had it. I planted bulbs in the yard for spring. I had Ruth over for dinner, twice. I started reading again in the evenings, something I had slowly stopped doing when the house was full, and the quiet was never quiet enough to concentrate. I also called Sandra. She didn't answer. I left a message. I said I loved her, and I hoped she and Kevin and Brianna were getting settled. I said my door was open when she was ready, meaning for conversation, meaning for healing, not meaning come back and live here. She knew the difference. Whether she chose to hear it was up to her. She called back on a Sunday, 3 weeks later. The call was short and not warm, but it was a call. She told me Brianna had been asking for me. I told her to tell Brianna I was ready anytime she wanted to visit. Sandra said okay. We said goodbye. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning of something that hadn't decided what it was yet. I have made peace with that. I taught children for 31 years, and if there is one thing that experience taught me, it's that people change on their own timelines, and you cannot grade someone on a rubric they haven't seen. What I know is this. The dry cleaners had given me my notice back, and I had been able to take it because the job had served its purpose, and I was tired of going home smelling like other people's coats. I was 69 years old and living in my own house and sleeping in my own bed, a real bed, in the room with the window that looks out at Dennis's oak tree. Ruth told me recently that I seemed like myself again. I thought about how to answer that, and then I said that I thought I might be more myself than I'd been in a long time. That 6 years of shrinking can make you forget how much room you actually take up. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone, even someone you love, is to stop making it easy for them to take from you what they haven't earned. I put the pearl necklace on the next Sunday morning. I wore it to church, and I wore it to lunch at Marion's with Ruth afterward. And when the light came through the window and caught it, I thought about Dennis choosing it, wrapping it in tissue paper, hiding it in the closet. I thought about how love, when it's real, is careful with the things that matter to the other person. I held my coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot and the street beyond it, and the ordinary November light on everything, and I thought, this is mine. This afternoon, this table, this coffee, this necklace, these feet that ache and these hands that have worked, and this life that still has room in it for good things. It had taken me a long time to come back to that, but I had come back.